This is the 3 o'clock slump for me. I'm Helaine Olen, and I'm an opinion writer with the Washington Post opinion pages.
Rob Atkinson, I'm president of the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation, which is a think tank in Washington.
Arun Sundararajan, professor at New York University. It's a university downtown.
Great, thank you guys all, and quiet on the set, everyone who's out there talking, or go take it in the hallway, it's fine. We're talking about the redefining work, but the landscape we know is changing. I'm curious to hear from the panelists, and I'll let whoever wants to kick it off, just specifically what is changing when it comes to work and employment and productivity. Arun, do you want to take that?
Sure. Okay, I think there are two digital forces that are changing, have started to change work and are likely to change them at an accelerated pace over the next couple of decades. One is the sort of the unbundling of the company in some sense, the creation of digitally enabled ways of allowing things that used to be done within the company to be done through
my iPhone.
Yes, yeah, through your
it's
iPhone.
All right here.
Yep. But you can sort of take that one step further, right? Because on the one hand, you've got companies like the New York Times who now have sophisticated systems that allow them to use employees and freelancers on projects in sort of a much more seamless way than they used to. But there's also fundamental redefinition of how the economic activity is organized that changes the scope of the company. So, take Airbnb and short-term accommodation. They've created capacity that exceeds that of the top 5 hotel chains in the world combined, but they've done it by creating a different way of organizing the activity. You've got a relatively small organization, and you've got people hosting people in their homes or in their spare rooms.
Which has completely uprooted the tourism industry.
Yeah, totally.
I mean, not completely uprooted, but it's made it a seismic shift in terms of how the tourism industry approaches training, work, and providing services to tourists.
Totally, and in some ways, the tourism industry has been one of the biggest growth stories of the 20th century. It went from sort of close to nothing to 400 million people worldwide. In a similar vein, you've got retail being redefined by this, where Amazon has hundreds of thousands of employees, sure, but they are doing a far greater capacity of retail with those hundreds of thousands of employees than if they were organized according to the Macy's model or the Walmart model. And connected to the Amazon platform are 5 million sellers who are running tiny retail businesses. So you've taken what used to be inside big companies and you've sort of split it up between the platform and a crowd of people who are sort of, depending on who you ask, either on-demand labor or running tiny businesses through the platform. So that's one big change. A second big change is the increasing sophistication of artificial intelligence and robotics technologies, in particular, the ability of computers to perceive the way that humans do. And I think that's the change that people are most worried about, or where there's the greatest variance in opinions, fear, perhaps misinformation. But that's, I think, the force that is causing people, that's the technology of our age that is causing the what will the humans do concern. And this is a familiar concern, right? I mean, this is a concern that you had 200 years ago with the manufacturing workers in Manchester, in the 60s as factories started to get automated in Detroit and Cleveland. There were fears.
Assembly line.
Yeah. But those are the two big changes that I'm paying most attention to, because while I don't think they will wipe out the human workforce, or that they're not qualitatively different from automation changes we've seen in the past or work changes that we've seen in the past, I think they will cause very significant transition pains over the next 20 years in ways that could be potentially destabilizing to society unless we manage them well.
Do you like to be Bob or Robert?
Rob.
Rob. I didn't give you either of those choices, but I'm going with Rob now. Rob, do you worry? Are these things that keep you up at night in how the workforce is changing and what it means for the future of our economy and the world at large?
Sure. So, we've been looking at this question, probably longer than anybody else, at least 10 years, long before Osborne and Frey did their completely flawed but quite popular study that said 47% of jobs are going to be eliminated. And I actually worry about something 180 degrees opposite. My worry is that we're not going to have enough innovation. We're not going to have enough productivity.
Okay.
We're in a situation now where in the next 20 years, the dependent to worker ratio is going to be skyrocketing because all the baby boomers are going to retire. And unless we figure out a way to raise productivity, only two possibilities. One is current workers will just get taxed more and they'll get less money, or old people will get less benefits. So that's the only answer other than growth. So when I look at the world, I actually don't. I'm much more on the sort of conservative side, and not in the political sense, but in the pace of change. For example, we've now in the last 12 years had the lowest rate of labor productivity growth, probably since in American history, but certainly since 1947 when the government started collecting that data. We're not raising productivity. If you look at the new BLS study that just came out about a year ago on contingent work, I 100% agree with Arun that there have been a rise of certain kinds of contingent work, but when you balance it all out, what the BLS finds is that the share of the workforce involved in contingent work, either part-time or self-employment or other contract work or others, it's actually lower than it was 20 years ago. It's completely opposite. Everybody the problem with this debate is everybody extrapolates from two things, their phone and their Uber.
I was just going to say the Uber driver.
Yeah. Oh my God, everybody's an Uber driver and this phone stuff is so cool. The reality is contingent work is not growing. Self-employment is at the lowest. My colleague Mike Linden and I just wrote a book last year for MIT Press called Big is Beautiful, Debunking the Myth of Small Business. There are fewer people self-employed in the US than there ever have been since certainly 100 years. There are fewer workers work in small businesses than there ever have been. So all the trends don't suggest that. And I'm skeptical on AI. AI is not magic. I mean, to me, the best scholar on AI is your colleague, Gary Marcus, at NYU. Gary has a fantastic new book with an MIT colleague, and he calls AI idiot savants. If you want to play Go, you don't want to play against an AI, but if you want to figure out how to walk to the back of the room and get some coffee, you don't want an AI to do it. And I really don't think AI is ever going to get to that position. So having said that, we're at about 1.2% productivity growth a year. I would be incredibly surprised and incredibly happy if we could get to 3.5. Now, to put that in perspective, we had 3.5% productivity in the 60s. We had about 3% in part of the 90s and the 2000s. And we're actually some of the happiest, most stable times in American history, because when productivity grows, workers get more money, companies are investing, the economy is humming along, and yeah, there's a little bit more disruption. It's really, as Friedman said in his book, The Mystery, that wasn't The Mystery of Economic Growth, Harvard economist, he said that it's when you don't have growth that's corrosive to democracy. So I'm not really worried. The last thing I'll just say, we absolutely, and here Arun and I 100% agree, we absolutely have to do a better job of workers who are displaced. I mean, we probably do the worst job in the OECD of all countries. Just terrible job. Unemployment insurance benefits are bad. Ability to go into retraining is bad. The unemployment systems to find work is bad. We can all agree that we could, really, really radically improve that. But I worry about all of this. It's going to be so fast, we need to slow it down. When you have Bill Gates saying we need a robot tax, and Bill de Blasio here, the mayor, saying you need a regulatory agency that would approve all automation, it's pretty dramatic slowdown of growth if you do that.
See, Arun and Helaine are both lifting up their microphones, but I'll let you go. And then
I agree with you on a lot of this. I think automation crept in as a story because we had a couple of different things going on at the same time, which is first, obviously, we did have some major technological progress. Second, the workforce participation rate is lower than it was in 2000, 2007, prior to the Great Recession. So there's been this sense of, oh, okay, what could this be? And there's this kind of lazy assumption on the part of a lot of people people, it must be technological progress. At the same time, I think this myth actually feeds into something else, which is it allows us to ignore, and by I mean the power structure to ignore, the fact that a lot of this has actually been caused by the massive financialization of the economy. That we have a lower entrepreneurship rate than we did in the 1980s, for example. This is probably not about AI. This is probably about the fact that we live in a country that doesn't encourage this for any number of reasons, from the fact that people don't, feel unsteady about benefits, to the fact they don't have savings, to the fact that they have especially for the younger generation, and even like the parents of them have student loan debt. So this is all stuff that starts feeding into the narrative. At the same time, if there was this explosion of automation, there are positions, I should say, that people could do. It's not like, caretaking jobs have gone away. And if anything, we've had massive disinvestment in them. The same for our infrastructure, which is literally, as anybody who takes the subway knows, or the Washington Metro, is literally falling apart around us. So, this has sort of become this sort of convenient story to sort of get around, a bigger economic problem. As for the gig economy, I tend to agree it's somewhat exaggerated, but I would also point out that as someone who was in the workforce in the 1990s and can remember the Microsoft lawsuits, no small part of this is actually probably, could be shut down or taken care of in some way with actual enforcement of tax law. And that is something that is not currently going on very much, that there are ways that we define who is an employee and who is not. And if the IRS would step in, my guess is some portion of these people would be declared employees.
Oh, I think a large percentage of
Yeah.
those people will be declared. And companies are bending over backwards to make sure that they don't get caught in that trap. I mean, it is unbelievable, the smoke and mirrors that goes on to make contract workers off the books and as far away as possible.
Yeah, but I think that's sort of the classification issue of like, is someone an employee or not, it's sort of asking the wrong question. Because I've got serious doubts about the BLS's estimates of contingent workers, or of people in what I think of as non-employment work arrangements, something other than full-time.
Why is that?
Because the way that they frame the questions makes it very likely that a vast majority of, I hate to go back to this example, Uber drivers are not going to answer yes to a question that is framed as, do you sell something independently through an electronic market? They don't think of themselves as selling something through an electronic market. They're like, no, I drive for Uber. And so, not to beat up on the BLS, I understand that you need sort of temporal consistency in the way that these things are asked. You can't just throw out the survey and bring in a completely new one, because you need comparability. But I think that a lot of why, the difference, I think, between today's worker classification lawsuits and challenges, and what was happening with contract workers in Microsoft or even in FedEx, is that this isn't a situation where someone is doing the same thing as an employee but misclassified. What we've done is we've created a continuum of degrees of dependency that a person might have on a company. An Etsy seller has some degree of dependency on Etsy, but it's not really fitting into that employee box. An Airbnb host has some degree of dependency on Airbnb. A YouTube content creator, if you took away their access to YouTube, so they are economically dependent. Uber drivers economically dependent on Uber. And we're going to see sort of varying levels of dependency and a host of different arrangements. And, instead of, what we've stuck with in parallel with that is a safety net that is designed for one work arrangement, the full-time employment work arrangement. I mean, in the United States, we don't fund a lot of benefits through government. We do it through this, either the company or some sort of partnership. And so the real challenge or the real answer to me isn't to classify workers right, but to get to a point where that classification doesn't matter a lot, because we have funding arrangements to provide a safety net for people independent of their work arrangement. So Uber may not have the same liability as a full-time employer, but they have some responsibility. And as long as we can put in place structures that allow different funding models for different levels of dependence, I think we'll be in a much better place.
But Helaine, isn't where the system is broken is the social contract itself, and not because if it's the financial challenges that are stopping people from being entrepreneurial, from creating new jobs, then it's all due to them not being able to afford health care or not having money for retirement or caregiving, whatever it is. There's just so many forces at play.
Right, I would agree. I mean, I would say a couple of things. First, there actually is a model that works fairly decently for these people, if this is indeed what's really going on, and it is the Hollywood trade worker unions. The Writers Guild, the SAG, and so on, where when you are hired by whatever studio, they have to pay in, so that they pay in part for the health insurance benefits, they pay in part for the employment taxes. So, if the companies wanted to do this, there's a model easily available to do it.
But you also know that it also means that work can't happen unless it's a guild gig.
Right, exactly. But it's not incredibly hard to become a guild member.
No, but I'm saying on the flip side, just as an employer, it can be really challenging because you really can't get work done unless everybody's on board, and things happen, and therefore it makes it very expensive. You just think about all the strikes that have happened in the past.
Right, but let's say you're an Uber driver. The Uber pays in when you're driving.
No, absolutely.
Full stop.
Right.
I mean,
Full stop.
I think part of the issues with the classifications are going on is, if I had to make a guess based on my conversations with people, is that people, as you've pointed out, I don't think people themselves understand their classifications. And I think it goes in both directions. I think on one hand, you have people who will say, I work for Uber. If you call them up or you ask them to fill out an email survey, an online or mail survey, because, hey, they're doing Uber or Lyft or whatever 40 hours a week. I think on the other hand, you have a lot of people in somewhat denial about what they're doing. So they'll be, well, I'm only doing this for a few weeks while I'm in between jobs, and somehow a few weeks lasts 2 years. Or I once had somebody tell me they were driving at night because they didn't want to commute home. I mean, you get excuses, and I think this makes it very hard to figure out what's going on sometimes. But what I would say is that we don't have a major safety net in this country, and it's deteriorating quickly for a lot of people. I mean, God knows what's going to happen at the next recession. And I think that there's been, the other issue is that, when as you can see what's going on in California, this has become a very hard thing to get a grasp on. They have, they've passed legislation to try to put some more boundaries around this and get some of these people classified as employees. And they're doing it in part because of the tax revenue, because they are losing tax revenue over this situation. But the result is they're getting pushed back in both directions, because some of the people are claiming, well, they're just not going to hire me, because solving this on a state-by-state level is actually fairly hard, because you can just turn out of state to do it. Yet at the same time, you've got to wonder, right now they have it as, where it's been controversial right now is with writers, and I think it's 30 or 35 pieces a year, and you're deemed an employee. And you're kind of like, and I've seen people write in, well, I'm writing 20 blog posts a month at $40 a pop. And it's kind of like, well, that actually does sound like an employee to me.
So and work, the gamut is a lot. There's people who work in corporate America, there's small businesses, they're gig workers. So I want to make sure that we give fair time to everything, because it's, it's all of these pieces together that drive an economy. But my understanding is it's actually small business at the end of the day here in the U.S., and maybe not fair to say around the world, but aren't small businesses the biggest employers?
No, they're not, actually. That's one of the points
Myths.
that Mike and I made in our book. There's a lot of mythology about small business. If you
All right,
look
debunk the myth for me.
So if you just look at private employment, leaving out government, about 53% of American workers work in big businesses and 47% in small. That number's been going up over the years, not down. There's also this other mythology, started way back when by David Birch at MIT in the late 70s, that small businesses are the source of most new jobs. Again, that's completely wrong. What you have to, when you control for age, you don't see that. But it turns out that a lot of new jobs come from new firms. Now, you have to then unpack that. And so, according again to the Census Bureau, if you look at what they call the micro data on firms, if you take the typical firm and you say, how many jobs do they create each year of their existence? They create jobs in year 1, they lose jobs all the way to year 22. In other words, you take all the companies that were created in 1990. They created a lot of jobs in 1990, and then you take that cohort, follow them down till 2012, they lose jobs every year. And it's because there's this sort of iconic revolving door. Fred opens up a pizza parlor, and Sally opens up something else, and they just go out of business. And so, again, and by the way, the average wage in small businesses is about 30% less. The opportunity to get benefits is, dramatically less. The opportunity to get retirement. I actually, the data is super clear. The best thing we could do to help workers, in my view, would be to have a level playing field between big and small companies. I'm not saying we should favor big companies, but right now, small companies, it's legal in the US to discriminate if you're an employer, to discriminate on the basis of gender, age, and religion if you have and race, if you have less than 15 workers. Why would we allow that? What possible rationale could we say if you're an employer and you have 10 workers, you don't want to hire blacks or you don't want to hire women or Muslims? I mean, and we do that because we're like, oh, we want to be small business friendly. And I think we should. I'm really opposed to in Obamacare, for example. I think if we want to have employers do healthcare, every employer should provide healthcare.
I think I take that one step further and say that you've got to stop differentiating between people who earn a living through large businesses or through some sort of formal arrangement with formal structured exclusive arrangement with another business, and people who are flexibly earning money by depending on one or more large businesses. Because I don't see a significant growth in the full-time employment work arrangement in the long run, simply because large businesses have so many alternatives to full-time employment. People seek out full-time employment today in part because that's what's got the stability and the benefits and the structure around it. And so either you embrace it yourself or you have a spouse who embraces it, and then you sort of pursue your freelance or your entrepreneurial dreams because someone else's benefits are taking care of you. And and I've thought a lot over the last few years as to sort of how does one make the social safety net work arrangement agnostic, sort of starting from a point where you've got a system that is designed for full-time employment. And I realize we don't want to just talk about the social safety net. I do want to go back to some of the points that Rob made earlier about productivity.
Keep in mind, too, that it's the global dream for them, so it's not just the U.S., too.
Yeah.
And the dynamics are very different when you leave.
Yeah, so, but it seems like, at least in the United States, it's going to be really hard to refashion this social contract without sort of a broader scale sort of economic and political restructuring. I mean, the forces that will lead to whatever social contract we end up with in 20 years are aligned in a way to not favor a strong social contract in this world of more flexibility.
Do any of you think it's really going to be that different in 20 years compared to how it was 20 years ago or 40 years ago?
A little bit, I think I think we always overestimate the pace of change, and we overestimate the technology's impact on this change. And so, so I agree with Rob that, the AI sort of tension is in part an overestimation of the capabilities of the technology itself, but also an overestimation, and we've talked about this before, on what is possible and what will happen. Just because we've had the technology for those self-checkout machines that we see popping up in different stores for a couple of decades, but it's taken a long time for the technology
I
to
personally
actually...
love to check out my own stuff. I think it's so much fun.
I kind of like...
You do too?
It depends on the quality of the machine, right? But I mean, what I'm trying to get at is that just because, to the study that Rob pointed to, the Fry and Osborne, that 47% of work can be automated with technology by 2015, that doesn't mean it will be. There's a whole bunch of other changes that are going to sort of come into play. And I share Rob's concern that we're not going to invest fast enough. I think we're going to stand in contrast to Japan, that is making big investments in automation right now because they have reached the point that we're all going to reach, like in a few decades, of having a significantly higher average population age and having a sort of a lower workforce participation. And so they're in a place where they can invest aggressively in robotic technologies to automate work because they need it, and they're going to start to see those productivity gains. And like things like robot taxes or this sort of fears that automation will wipe out jobs are going to actually be the thing that wipes out the jobs in the long run because we haven't invested enough in the technologies to grow the economies and create the jobs of the future.
I want to actually change this slightly because this is something that keeps coming up, which is the aging of the workforce. And one of the issues is how are we going to keep these people in the workforce? As people live longer, and presumably they will continue to live longer, right now we have a situation where we're kind of, on one hand, you can read the personal finance press and, it's like, go stay in the workforce, stay in the workforce. In fact, we have a situation set up right now that discourages people from staying in the workforce in a lot of ways. Age discrimination is a rampant problem. The Urban Institute actually did a really depressing study about this that they put out. I swear, I think they didn't want people to read it, the week between Christmas and New Year's of last year. Most people over the age of 50 will probably be involuntarily separated from a job at some point, and if they are, they will probably not achieve their position, income-wise again. At the same time, we have a work structure that is encouraging people to work full-time. And these people are, as a rule, in the United States, which is what we're talking about, very expensive to employ full-time. Their health insurance, as long as we have our health insurance system, they are, until they turn 65, the most expensive people to have. So they are the least, in some ways, often unlikely to get hired, partly as a result of this. At the same time, the gig jobs that are available are often not what they're quite looking for. Yeah. Somebody doesn't want to get laid off as an accountant and drive for Uber or make crafts on Etsy or work piecemeal 10 hours a week for some big accounting firm somewhere, God knows where. So how do you start evening all this out? And I think this is something that is a very non-sexy topic, but a very important topic that kind of gets shoved under the table when we talk about the exciting future of work and sort of what AI is going to do for all of us.
I moderated a panel in San Francisco last week about millennials in the workforce and the fact that, most of the companies that were on the panel, the majority of their workers were millennial. No, they were California, Salesforce, for example. Overwhelmingly, the majority are millennial workers.
I would point out that there's a massive age discrimination problem in Silicon Valley, and it starts at about age 40, and it's been reported on fairly extensively.
What's interesting about millennial workers, and maybe this is a little bit of a shift, but is how they are changing the narrative in terms of what they expect from their employer. So, we were young, idealistic, wanted things to change. Apparently, our generation didn't speak up enough. Millennial workers demand that companies do good, be better. Is it all smoke and mirrors, or are they really changing the landscape?
Well, it's easy to say you want your employer to do good. It's a lot harder to say I want to have flexible work. And the other one point that you didn't talk about, which I think is important, is new parents.
Right.
Oh,
I was also going. Yeah, I left out new parents and caretaking. By the way,
but there seems to be a seismic shift in terms of men taking leave.
Well, sure, but I mean,
they're not taking 6 months.
It's about the seismic shift of hardly anybody, women or men, taking
the denominator is small.
None of us take enough vacation.
Yes.
We know that.
Well, it's not just vacation, but I mean, we should have an expectation that people, when they have small children, you should be able to have flexible work where maybe you only want to work 30 hours or 25 hours, and it may be the man does 25 and the woman does 25 or whatever. People work that out in their own lives. But we don't have that. We don't have that for older people. A lot of older people would want to work 20 hours as an accountant and phase down. And the problem is it's a collective action problem because no individual firm wants to do it. They want the whole kit and caboodle. So we have to have some sort of societal pressure. Millennials, maybe that'll help. I don't think it's enough.
Millennial caregivers is also the fastest growing cohort. And again, I'm a little skeptical. Are they really going to change the conversation? But we talked about the sandwich generation of caring for kids and caring for aging parents, but there are more of them that are apparently caregiving than ever, and they're demanding that the companies are giving them flexibility to do that. Do you think it will make a difference?
No, I think it'll help, but I think the only thing, and this is where, Arun, I think I'm a little more optimistic than you are. I think that the political economy forces in the U.S. are shifting fairly strongly towards away from this sort of companies can do whatever they want at any time, and we have to do to a much more of almost a social democratic arrangement. We're not going to go as far as the Swedes, but we're going in that direction, I believe, and that could be a good thing if we do it right.
Yeah, what I would say is, I remember I was actually writing about workforce issues in the 1990s for Working Woman magazine. And I remember a lot of this talk around Gen X, too. They weren't going to take real jobs. They wanted their freedom. They wanted to be free agent nation was what they called it back then. Yeah, and and as it turned out, it was somewhat exaggerated. Though I think the things that have lasted is the ability in some hipper offices to bring your dog to work. That seems to have lasted it out. But I think a lot of this really comes down to in part worker supply to corporate demand, which is still the corporations and the company, and I'm using corporations because mostly it is large employers, have more of the power. And secondarily, that the shift in how people think and where the rules coming from government. And if that shifts, you will see a bigger shift. I tend to think the Me Too movement was actually a response in some ways to the not great working environment for both men and women in their 20s and early 30s. I've always said that I think for women in particular it was a real shock. That this was a real generation brought up to think that they were going to come in and find equality, which was probably not fully true of you or me, and encountered what they encountered.
Yeah, I think what's different today, Helaine, I think it's not just Gen X. I think if you go back even further, you will find that every group at any point in time, the people who are sort of from their early 20s to their early 30s, want the same things that the people in their early 20s. So they want more flexibility. They want more. This is just sort of this is not a generational thing. This is simply sort of a phase of life thing. But I think what's different today is that the ability for large companies to offer that kind of flexibility has expanded dramatically. And I don't mean the bring your dog to work or sort of work out of home, but I mean the massive investments that I'm seeing large companies making in creating flexible work arrangements with people in something other than a full-time employment arrangement. So I think what's going to happen is that as people seek that flexibility, they will find it, but they won't find it necessarily under the full-time employee umbrella. You have companies that are saying, well, I don't need a full-time workforce for maintaining equipment installation if I'm a telecom provider. I can do this for the next generation using an on-demand workforce by giving them some training, video training online, and then calling on them when needed, because the density of the equipment is going to be so high that I can't afford the full-time workforce. And so this isn't just for younger people. It's for even that 50-something accountant or the 50-something lawyer who decides that they don't want to have that full-time job anymore now has a platform called Up Counsel where they can go and actually run a tiny law firm without running a small business, because the platform is managing client relationships. And so I think we're going to go well beyond the Uber drivers and the Etsy craft sellers into a wide variety of these kinds of non-employment flexible, run your own tiny business arrangements that are supported by large companies.
Will they come with the safety net, though? Will
They
come with the
won't. See, this
healthcare?
is
So
this,
then
this
how
is
can
the
that
problem.
be sustainable? How can things continue without healthcare, without retirement, without
Well,
the things that people
That's
need?
that's the big public policy challenge that we have to. I mean, like none of the Democratic presidential candidates are talking about this. They're sort of, well, it's probably not the phase in the election where people are talking about sort of the things that they're actually going to do. They're all sort of positioning themselves relative to each other, right? But before the last presidential election, Senator Mark Warner was really talking, he sort of got it. He understood that there was a particular structural change to how we fund the safety net that was necessary. And there was sort of an incremental path towards it. And then all of that sort of got swept away in the last 3 years. Maybe we'll sort of pick it up again. But it's not that, it's not like in 20 years we're going to be functioning without a safety net because nobody is a full-time employee or because less than half the workforce is full-time employed. It's that as more and more people pursue these non-full-time employment arrangements, the political pressure to actually make funding a alternative social safety net a high priority is going to grow. And so it will be refashioned. I mean, 100 years ago, we didn't have a social safety net.
I don't
the
want
pressure mounted.
Go ahead, I'll let you speak, but I want to get a couple other topics in. Go ahead.
Yeah, what I wanted to say is I don't think it's totally true this isn't coming up in the presidential election. It's just not coming up under the way you're putting it. I mean, this is what, Medicare for All is a huge issue. Admittedly, some of this push is coming from the problems in the employer healthcare sector, insurance provided sector. So there is plans to expand Social Security. Bernie Sanders has a plan, I believe Elizabeth Warren does as well, to expand Social Security. And these are coming up. Again, some of the push is not coming out of the alternative work arrangement model. It's coming out of the fact that the 401ks at the workplace have not really worked for an awful lot of people. That it's coming out of the fact that health insurance is costing people more and more money, and it's also costing employers more and more money, by the way. I would say the one thing in the flexible arrangements that also needs to be thought about, and this is for both employees, and traditional employees and more contingent employees, is that this can lead to a lot of, I don't want to quite use the word abuse, but a lot of smudging around the edges. I mean, one reason it has grown so much is because it works for employers. You can literally reach us anywhere. I notice there are phones right on this table, right? We can all be reached. Constantly. Your employer can get you at 6 o'clock at night.
I could send a tweet to you and you could retweet it.
Right. I mean, but your boss could say, hey, Lauren, when you get back to the office, can you do X or Y? And this is an imposition on your time. You might not think of it that way. On one hand, yes, it's great that you could go to your child's soccer game, but on the other hand, there's something to be said for going to a soccer game and not having to worry about hearing from somebody. And these are all things that need to be balanced. I personally happen to like the freedom of it, but I wouldn't deny that there's a huge amount of problems that come with it.
I wanted to ask a question about productivity, specifically around training and education. So can we make people more productive by training them, by teaching them things? And if so, how do we do that?
Well, I'll answer a slightly different question, which is something that I learned as a professor. This is a skill that you pick up when you teach, which is like, don't answer the question that is asked, but the one that you want to answer.
Well, yeah, that's...
They tell you that when you go on TV.
Yeah, I was going to say, that's what we do with talking points on TV. Yeah.
Well,
but I'm curious to hear what you have to say about education and digital upskilling and all those fun things.
Well, see, if you think about upskilling and reskilling, think about the language that we use around it, right? I mean, you just said upskilling.
I just like to say it. It sounds so cool.
And
I have no idea what it means, really.
Well, it means getting sort of new knowledge about things, and reskilling has sort of the same thing, shifting from one occupation, learning how to do the things associated with a different occupation, in part because your current occupation may be shrinking. Now, I've been a university professor for a couple of decades, and when I joined NYU, I was under the mistaken impression that people were sort of shelling out the big bucks to receive the content that I delivered to them in the classroom. And that's certainly a part of the product, but it's a little part of the product, right? I mean, it's, there's there's networking, there's the alumni network, there are clubs that people join that teach them how to sort of figure out whether they want to sort of pursue a particular profession. There's the rite of passage, there's the brand, there's the sort of understanding what I want to do with the rest of my life. All of that is packaged into this complex product that is like the 2-year or the 4-year degree. And it's a successful product for the most part in transitioning people from being 17 or 18-year-olds in high school to being productive members of the sort of like, the adult workforce. So I think the big challenge for the next couple of decades on the education front is going to be in creating a similar bundle for people who need to find a new occupation or need to improve their existing occupation. And the reason why I sort of picked up on the skilling aspect is that it emphasizes the how do you do this new work too much, instead of what needs to be wrapped around that learning that will actually help you achieve successful transition. I can't have been a factory worker and then be sent online for 3 months to become a computer programmer, and then you sort of toss me out and say, okay, my work is done. So the productivity gains are going to come once we figure out what the education product is. This is what drove, we figured out good education products for high school and college in the United States over the 20th century. And I still think that we have by far the best early career education system in the world in terms of its depth. You take the number 100 university in America, it's better than the number 100 university anywhere else in the world, right? But we haven't invested enough into mid-career education. I mean, JFK set up the community colleges during sort of those early, we're going to be automated fears of the 60s. And that's the real secret to sort of, connecting education, reskilling, upskilling
mid-career education.
Yeah, to mid-career education. And before we sort of carry on the discussion, I just wanted to clarify what I meant about the presidential candidates, which is that, I do agree that these topics are coming up. I just feel that we're in the phase of the discussion where, the things that are unlikely to be implemented because they're not pragmatic are the ones being discussed, like Medicare for All or Andrew Yang's Universal Basic Income, because everybody is sort of positioning themselves for the nomination. And once that is done, there will be a more pragmatic plan, which will not be Medicare for All, but which will be something else, perhaps, that expands health insurance.
I'm super mindful of time, and I do want to ask if there's any questions in the room, so think about it, and I will call on you. Rob, I want you to debunk this myth if it's in fact debunkable, because you seem like the kind of person that does these things for me. I've always been under the impression that if you're getting a computer science or technical degree at any university in the US right now, when you graduate, everything you've learned will be obsolete. That's what I've heard. Is that true?
No, that's completely not true.
Okay, good.
By the way, one quick point on the productivity thing. What's called growth economics literature shows that the lion's share of productivity doesn't come from human capital expansion. It comes from technical expansion. Having said that, it's still important, and the question is sort of how well do we do? I actually disagree with Arun. The fact that only 32% of American college seniors are fully numerate and 39% are fully literate, according to the Educational Testing Service, that tells you that the vast majority of college kids in the US are fundamentally not learning very much of anything. And I think that's a huge, huge problem. I mean, we have great research universities, but you sit in class, 300 people, 200 people, you're looking at your iPhone. I don't think we're doing a very good job at all. With regard to CS, no. I mean, CS isn't, as long as you're in a good CS program. My son just got a CS degree 2 months ago. And
Congratulations.
I know, I'm really happy.
Does he have a job?
He did a couple other things. He's writing a paper. In fact, he's going to Hong Kong to present it. But he's in the process of applying and doing interviews. So
the future's bright.
Keeping my fingers crossed. But his program was a really good program, and they were on the cutting edge. So he was learning machine learning and natural language processing. And so if you're in a good CS program, you're going to learn cutting edge things. And as long as you sort of keep your hand in, you're not going to be obsolete for a long, long time, I would argue.
I think the thing that has concerned me in all of this is, and I have not made up my mind whether you're going to be obsolete or not, because I've mostly not looked into it that closely, I will admit.
You will never be obsolete. You have too many opinions to be obsolete.
Well, there's always a market for opinions. Whether you get paid for them or not one day is another issue, right? is the issue of how this is going to be done and how it's going to be paid for. I saw an article like the other day, and don't ask me where I saw it because I'm not going to remember at this point, but it said something like people are going to need to be retrained every 3 to 7 years. And whether you, and let's accept this as true for a moment, right? Which I agree, it struck me as a little dubious, but let's accept for a moment that it's true.
That's a pretty broad range,
Yeah,
like 3 to 7.
Yeah, I was like, wait a second. Who on earth is paying for this, right? Yeah. We have a, whatever, you think of our system right now, is we have a massive student debt problem. So are we just going to add to it? One of the reasons we have this problem is because there has been the support for the state-funded land-grant universities has really been deteriorating over the past several decades. So are we going to up this? What about the fact that employers used to pay, used to train people on the job? I mean, presumably some of that should still be going on. Why isn't this going on? Why are they now sending them, out to be trained? Who's allowing them to get away with this? And it brings up all these questions again that we really have barely grappled with. And one thing I want to say is, it's going to sound like a slight digression. So I actually went to an Andrew Yang rally a few months ago. And, everybody was talking about automation. And it occurred to me that for the group of people who were there, actually I talked to a lot of people, that, getting a universal basic income was actually kind of aspirational. Because what I heard over and over again, and I should say these were tech people, these were not, because that tends to be who's attracted to his rallies, is these were people who had not had steady careers. I mean, these were people, in their 30-ish to their mid-30s who, were still like, yeah, I just started a new job, or, I worked here for 2 years. And, they were obviously reacting to something. But I didn't think it was quite the story that was being told on the stage.
Interesting. I want to go to the audience. If anybody has a question, we have a microphone. I will take a question.
Absolutely. Oh, and it is on. It works. Fantastic. So, organizers, Prerogative, Darren Fogelman, founder and CEO of Global Dream Forum. Thank you for a fascinating panel. I feel you guys could speak here until the wee hours tomorrow morning if need be. But you won't be. You won't be. But you could be. Anyway, a few key things just to mention. Want to get the panel's feedback on. First thing is, this has been a very US-centric discussion, as you acknowledged at the start. And obviously a lot of different global economies, well, nearly all of them are at different stages of development. Japan has come up due to the aging issue. But I'd like to just get a sense of where you're seeing best practice internationally, if any, from different countries, whether it be regulation, policy, or whether it be corporations standing up and actually taking responsibility. Because I don't see a lot of best practice in this country. I don't see a lot in the UK. And there needs to be a lot more. So please,
which Scandinavian country should I move to?
Not just necessarily Scandinavian, but any.
I actually think Singapore is the model. There's a report we wrote about 1.5 years ago on what would an agenda for the U.S. be to really beef up our workforce training and transition systems. And when you look at Singapore, they check every box with a world-class innovative system. So you get training vouchers that you can use, the online system for getting your own skills assessment, matching that to jobs that are in demand, matching that to skill opportunities, and then matching that to find a job is unbelievable. There's no reason we couldn't do that, by the way.
What's the secret sauce? How are they doing it better?
If you've ever talked to a Singapore government official, you'll know the answer, which is those people are incredibly high quality, they're super smart, they're well read, and they've just decided we're going to make it a national priority. We have an enormous amount of lip service and rhetoric in the U.S., but we don't make it a national priority. The second problem we have is we tend to run these programs through fairly staid bureaucratic institutions. One of the things I did when we did that study is I pretended I was an unemployed worker looking to move into computer science or coding. And in Maryland, I went to the state, what's called WIB, Workforce Investment Board. I went online and I put in what you want to computer science, and I got over 2,000 courses, which is might as well give me 1 million because they were meaningless. It was just some random coding word. Oh, it had computer in somewhere in the curriculum in some school somewhere. And that's par for the course of what we do in the U.S. I think it boils down to really political will. If you want to do it, we could do it, and we don't.
Yeah, I think the big difference between Singapore or, sort of any of you, take your pick of Scandinavian countries that, allow you to seamlessly, shift careers because you can sort of take time off and get sort of fully funded education is one of scale. And I haven't seen a good exemplar for, say, for the United States or for India or for Brazil or for Mexico or for countries that have tens or maybe hundreds of millions of people. And in many ways, that's really going to be the challenge. That how do you take a model that, where if you've got a government that can sort of tightly coordinate and that is looking at a problem that involves like hundreds of thousands or maybe like a couple million people, how do you make that work for 50 million people? And I don't really have a good exemplar on sort of the workforce retraining front.
See, I think it's the exact opposite, because in many of these situations, we're never going to be able to have a kind of one-on-one counseling, and it's too hard, it's too expensive. So we're going to have to use technology, and it's there that scale matters and gives you a huge advantage. Like, for example, building an incredibly robust AI-powered online employment and retraining system. You can do it. That's what the Singaporeans have done, and they've had to amortize, I don't know, $10, $20 million or whatever over a small population. It makes it a lot easier for us to do that. Same thing with Ireland. They have this fantastic program, and it's basically MOOCs for like plumbers. It's a technician-oriented, massively open online course. Again, building one of those videos is super expensive, but amortizing it over all of our plumbers or all of our air conditioning repair people or whatever it might be. So I think we could use scale to take advantage of it. There's nobody in government that wants to do that. That's the issue.
Well, we also have a government and, frankly, a population that doesn't want to invest in things at the moment. So, one of the things that's going on is one of the reasons our public education results are what you just elaborated, which is absolutely true, is because of a lack of investment. Europe, Western European countries, and places like Singapore invest at a higher rate in their education system, and surprise, they get better results.
Yeah,
Who could have guessed?
Numeracy is definitely higher in Singapore.
Right.
Could I just ask you, which of you, I mentioned corporations as well. If you could each just name quickly one corporation that you think is really looking to redefine the world of work, is aware of its social responsibilities as a stakeholder, and is really leading the way. If you can just, I know we're pushed on time, but if you could give one or two.
I've got two. I mean,
two is fine.
Yeah, Amazon and Walmart.
Amazon and Walmart.
Yeah, they're taking very different approaches. I mean, Walmart has its, go to college for $1 a day. They've got, it's not surprising that I'm naming Amazon and Walmart. These are both retail companies. This is where change is in fact occurring, and there will be automation in sort of the near future, and hundreds of thousands, if not millions of workers are going to have to be transitioned. Walmart's is much more of a sort of a market-based system in some sense, like, the people can choose what they want, and Walmart is heavily subsidizing on-the-job training, transition parts. Amazon's is much more centralized, where they say, here are, we need to transition, 70,000 people from fulfillment centers over the next 2 years. Let's go out and find 70,000 jobs for them. Let's sort of use our market power to actually sort of line up these employment opportunities, and then just sort of work backwards and actually sort of retrain them for the jobs that we're going to place them in.
I know we need to wrap this up. Rob, what company
I actually
would you
need
say?
to run, so I'm just going to say, and then I apologize, everybody.
No,
for
we're going to
running.
end. We're going to end.
But I think the answer would be to look at, actually, President Trump has a workforce of the future or something commission of major CEOs who've committed time to this, and they've all agreed, they've signed a pledge. It's really an interesting pledge where they've committed to doing many of these things we're talking about. And so I would look at those companies because their CEOs have committed to doing this. Lockheed Martin, for example, SAP, a number of really leading companies. And the fact that they at least said they're going to do it and many of them are following through, it appears, to me, that's a positive sign. So, and I apologize.
I don't have a company. What I'll find is I will like companies when they do one specific thing, and then I will find something else they don't like. So I will say what I've liked is like the Salesforce, gender.
I have to end it.
Okay, that's fine.
We're going to end it, but I'm just going to say Patagonia, and I'm going to thank you guys so much for your time. Rob's already halfway out the door, but thank you so much, Arun, Helaine, and thank you guys for being such a rapt audience.
Thank you.